Okay, so this is the Bible study for Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. And it's the story of Moses fleeing Egypt to Midian. And the text says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now, priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, when the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" Reuel asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him and have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. All right, so remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And that will allow you to follow along with us as we ask questions about this text and try to make sure we understand what's going on in this text, but then maybe even more important, apply it to our lives. So number 1 says, what have we talked about so far in the book of Exodus? So that's a couple of Bible studies already that we've studied in Exodus. A, Joseph and his entire generation have died. B, the Israelites multiplied and became numerous, and the new king who didn't know Joseph was afraid of what might happen if the Israelites opposed him. C, he subjected Israel to hard labor and oppressed them, but they still multiplied. D, he instructed the midwives to kill the male babies when they were born. E, when this didn't work, he ordered that all Hebrew male children be killed. And F, Moses was born and somehow was protected from all of this, was found by the Pharaoh's daughter, nursed by his own mother, and became the child of the Pharaoh's daughter. And so all of that is true. And the last few were in our last Bible study. Obviously, we're moving into the end of chapter 2, so there's a lot of summary there in the things that happened, but that's how we got here to this point. That's how we got to the point where now we fast forward to now Moses has grown up. When, according to 2:11, does this next story happen? It says one day after Moses had grown up. So it doesn't tell us how long it had been. It doesn't tell us whether, according to the Egyptian customs, that grown up was, 14 or 15, or whether grown up was 25 or 26. And we know that has changed over time. But apparently old enough to understand right from wrong and have developed that within him, regardless of law and what other people were saying. Maybe not old and mature enough to temper his passion, apparently, but old enough to survive on his own and head out into the desert on his own. And so sometime later, number 3 says, what happened according to 2:11 through 14? A, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. So this must have been quite a difficult situation for him. His people are slaves, and yet he's been raised in the palace. He's been raised by Pharaoh's daughter as an Egyptian and as Pharaoh's own grandson. And yet when he goes out there, he sees people that look like him being treated badly, and there has to be some sort of wrestling within him where it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that they are getting this treatment. It doesn't seem fair that he is not. It doesn't seem fair that the people that he grew up sort of being cared for by and taught by, the Egyptians, were wronging people that looked like him. So he's loyal. This could be the plot of any number of Disney movies. The plot, his people to whom he is loyal because they've cared for him, the Egyptians, are mistreating his people to whom he was born. Perhaps you might say because of their skin color, or because of their ethnicity, or because of what they looked like and what their culture was, they were enslaved. And he is not enslaved, but now probably torn. And so why was he watching that day? I'm sure perhaps in his adolescence, and he was trying to process who he was and which of these people he really was. Was he really Egyptian, or was he really Hebrew? And all of us kind of go through those times in our lives. Those of us who have been through difficult circumstances or been displaced from our family of origin, perhaps, might struggle with that even more and have more complicated and confusing feelings. Somebody who's been adopted may long to know their adopted parents, but at the same time have mixed feelings, want to know where I came from, but at the same time understand that where I came from doesn't matter as much as who raised me and who loved and cared for me. And so Moses is in a difficult situation because the people who raised him, most people who are adopted are thankful for those who raised them, and maybe harbor some resentment to the parents who may have given them up for adoption. But now here's Moses sort of experiencing the opposite, because the people who raised him were the ones that caused the suffering that led to the adoption. And so now this complication must have caused all sorts of emotion that might have led him to lash out in his passion. So he's watching them in their hard labor. That must, it wasn't an accident that he was out there watching. B, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Yes. C, he looked both ways, so he knew what he was about. This is what we would call in our legal system today premeditated, because he thought about it first, made sure no one was looking before he killed the Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew. This is a challenging situation. C, yeah, that was what I read. D, the next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting and asked the one in the wrong why he was hitting his fellow Hebrew. So now it's one thing to see a Hebrew being mistreated by an Egyptian, but then why would you mistreat your own people? And by the way, that's a theme in the Old Testament, and in God's messages to the Israelites in the Old Testament, perhaps even in Moses's own writings. But the man asked, who made him ruler and judge? So, and then asked if Moses was going to kill him like he killed the Egyptian. So that's a scary thing, because now he realizes he's found out. But before we move on to thinking about that, I'd like to just consider the fact um, that Moses seems to be inherently understanding righteousness and justice, and seems to be interested naturally in fighting for righteousness and justice. And I say this because in like the next Bible study, I think it will be, we're going to be talking about Moses's calling and the burning bush and all of that. And I think it's easy for us to read texts like that and sort of mysticize the calling of God. Sort of consider it a very mystical thing, is what I mean, how God calls his people, and assume that God's calling is somehow distinct and different from our natural leanings or abilities or giftings. But we got to remember, one, that God created us and God has been ordaining our circumstances, and watching over us even from birth, and the things that shape us, even when we're not following him, even when we're going through difficult circumstances that don't seem to be um, having anything to do with God at all, yet God is present and he's shaping us. And so then when he calls us, he has already gifted us. Now, those gifts may not be evident sometimes. I would say this, that my gift for preaching and teaching, which I really do believe that I have, you may argue as you're listening to this, but I really do believe that I have that gift. But I can tell you, the first day I started preaching and teaching, it would have not been very evident that I had that gift. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't have it. That doesn't mean that um, that somehow he gifted me after the call, but it does mean that a gift or a strength, tendency could be left undeveloped and need developed, but that doesn't mean God hasn't already placed it in us, and he hasn't already been shaping that gift. And I say all that because in this story, and it's not, we'll talk about it more when he shows up in Midian even, but in this story, Moses, in the future, fast forward, spoiler alert, Moses becomes the rescuer of Israel. Moses becomes the leader that leads his people out of this suffering, and delivers them from all of this injustice. And we might say, well, look what God did in him after his call, after he called him, because Moses didn't have certain gifts. For instance, he was a stutterer and was afraid to even um, talk to Israel, or even talk to Pharaoh about situations. And so he wasn't confident. He didn't think he had the gifts. And yet there was something internal to him, a passion for fighting for what's right, a passion for justice that was already showing up as a young person. Now he had grown up, but was young in his growing up, I'm sure. Um, and in Egypt he was already fighting for justice, and then God called him and used that passion that God himself had surely put in him for God's purpose in Israel. And so anyway, that there's something about these stories, and if, as we believe and have talked about in the introduction to Exodus, if Moses was the one that compiled this, or began compiling this, or wrote this down, then Moses is talking about his own life story, probably after all this happened, and reflecting back on something. Why would he reflect on this moment? Was it because it was the moment that drove him out into the desert, and that was an important turning point and plot point in the story? Sure. But he could have just explained that away and said, some difficult circumstances arose that led me out into the desert and out to Midian. But he didn't say that. He told the story, which illustrates that early on he was somebody who cared about justice and righteousness. Um, and I don't think that that's an accident. Now, he may have included the killing of the Egyptian to point out that he didn't always handle it right, and that God can use anybody, even a murderer. I've heard taught from this text, and that's true. But also, God was using the person that really, really cared about justice and what was right, and was compassionate towards people that were oppressed. Um, and is it um, isn't that what God does in our lives too? Doesn't God use the passions that he's put within us to fulfill our callings, and even sometimes to show us our callings? Um, so then number 4, what happened in verse 15? When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So now he wants to tell us about the story about one particular day. So he sort of summarized the fleeing to Midian, and I'm sure that there's general summary in the first part of verse 15, and then something very specific that sets up verse 16 is one day he sat by a well. But it doesn't say one day he sat by a well. It says he fled to, Pharaoh's trying to kill him, he fled to Midian, where he sat down by a well. And so there's probably some passage of time here, maybe not a lot of passage of time. I don't know how long it took him to get to Midian, and whether he sat down by the well the first day, um, or whether he had to sit down by the well for some time before he found a place to settle in. Um, and but that is not an important part of the story. Apparently, he just got us to the important part. Number 5, what happened next, according to 2:16 through 22? The 7 daughters of a priest of Midian came to draw water for their father's flock. Well, the fact that there was 7 daughters might suggest that, and they were working to feed and water the flock, might suggest that there were no sons, or maybe the sons were also priests, and so it fell to the daughters to make sure that the The flock was watered. It doesn't really say, but these poor daughters wandering around were apparently having a hard time of it because they had, it says, some shepherds drove them away. So they tried to go get water for the flocks, and they were driven away from that area where they could get water. It seems like, well, let me keep going. Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flocks. So here again, somebody's being oppressed or unfairly treated, and he gets up and does something about it. And we're establishing a pattern in Moses's life. D, the girls went home and their father wondered why they had returned early. So apparently it makes you think that perhaps this was a regular problem, and that oftentimes it took them a long time. It took them the whole day to be able to find water, and they had to get last pick. They'd been driven away until everybody else had had their fill, and maybe they ended up having to go different places to find some place where nobody else wanted to get their flocks in for the water. And this particular day, Moses came to their rescue and helped them water their flocks. Maybe just the fact that he was helping made it go faster, but probably the fact that he made sure that they got in early and didn't have to wait till everybody else was done because they kept getting driven away. Might have been why they had ended up coming home early. And so this was strange. When they got home early, the father asked, and they told him, they told him a story, and he asked them to invite him to have something to eat. So he says, hey, this guy that cares about my daughters, that would fight for what's right and protect them and make it easier for them. He is, that's a good guy. Why didn't you invite him home to eat? And then Moses married one of the daughters and gave birth to a son. So there you go. That all happened. 6, meanwhile, what was happening in Egypt, according to 2:23 through 25? A, the king of Egypt died. B, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out for help. C, their cry went up to God. And D, God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So spoiler alert, this is setting up how we get fast forwarded to the time. This didn't happen in one day. He got married, had a baby, and the king died all in one day. No, that's not the way it happened. There's a passage of time. He got married, they had a child. In the meantime, the Israelites are still in slavery, but the king dies and the slaves are crying out, and God heard them, and he's preparing Moses to be the one that goes back and helps in this situation. Number 7 says, what do we learn about Moses through this story? A, he must have a little bit of a temper. I think that might be if he killed the guy. I mean, it seems like he could have corrected the guy or done anything but kill the guy. But he was angry, and he had some sort of a temper to kill this Egyptian. B, he had a heart for his own people, and I think that's true. And C, he was bothered by injustice no matter where he saw it, and seems compelled to come to the rescue of those who are oppressed. And that's, I think, the theme of this whole story. And I don't think that's an accident. And I think for us to sort of jump into the calling of Moses at the burning bush and see it as purely mystical and instantaneous, this calling would be, I don't think we should deny the miracle of the burning bush and the thing that God did in that moment. But I think we have a tendency to sensationalize the stories and sort of create an aura around the burning bush that suggest that this is the way God speaks and he calls, and not realize that God had already been speaking, God had already been calling. God sometimes has to do something amazing to get our attention. And we'll read about how Moses was confused about what he saw and went to investigate, and God got his attention in that way. But it really seems like God had already been preparing him. And if Moses was looking at and seeing the gifts and the passions that he already had, he might have guessed that God would use him in this way. But he was probably in denial. He probably didn't want God to use him in this way. He probably didn't feel worthy of God using him in this way. He was probably in the moment, although if he's telling this story looking back on it, he thought all this was important and he saw the context of it. But in the moment, he was probably thinking that he didn't have any gifts, or he was not ever to be the person that would do something like this, because of his stutter perhaps, or whatever. Whereas God saw this gift that was already there, looking out for justice and caring for the oppressed. And I say that all because maybe God will give you a burning bush experience. Maybe God will have to do something like that to get your attention. But it's possible that after he does that, when you look back on your life, you will begin to see the times when he was already speaking through his giftings in you, and that other people had already seen it even before you came to accept it, because they saw the fact that the things that God had already put in you to equip you for the work that he had for you to do. Number 8, do you think it is a coincidence that God uses Moses for his plan to rescue Israel? No, absolutely not. God prepared it from when he was a child. God rescued him. And when there was, likely not a lot of male Hebrews around, because so many of them were being killed, yet God saved him and prepared him. And the fact that he had this compassion and care for his people, what made him the ideal person. And he had clout to be able to approach Pharaoh because he was Egyptian. He wasn't raised a slave. And so God had prepared him all the way, and put this passion and compassion for the oppressed and for his people in him. 9, what similarities and differences do you see when you compare Moses to yourself? Probably a lot of us see the things that we've done that we think disqualify us. Probably a lot of us see the weaknesses instead of the gifts. But if we look after the fact with reflection on our life, after we've responded to the call of God, I bet we also would see the times that God was preparing us and had gifted us just for such an occasion. Or in Esther, they said for just such a time as this.